The admission hall of the Galactic Military Academy stretched like a cathedral of polished obsidian, its walls adorned with holographic displays showing the greatest victories of a dozen species. Crystalline pillars reached toward a ceiling that seemed to dissolve into starfield, while the air hummed with the subtle harmonics of universal translators working overtime. At the center of it all sat the admission board, 7 beings representing the most influential military powers in known space. Admiral Zeftar of the Hegemony lounged in his biomechanical chair, 6 arms folded in practiced disdain. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the artificial lights, compound eyes tracking every movement with predatory precision. To his left, General Morden of the Iron Republics sat rigid as a mountain, her granite-like skin bearing the ceremonial scars of 1,000 campaigns. The other board members, a floating gas being from the Ethereal Collective, a crystalline entity from the Silicon Confederacy, and others whose species had earned their place through millennia of conquest, all shared the same expression of barely concealed skepticism. At the center of their collective gaze stood a human woman. She couldn't have been more than 30 standard years old, unremarkably average in height and build by galactic standards. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple military regulation bun, and her dress uniform bore only the basic service ribbons that any career officer might accumulate over a decade of peacetime service. No campaign medals caught the light, no battle honors gleamed from her chest. She stood at attention with the practiced ease of someone comfortable with military protocol, but there was something in her posture, a looseness around the shoulders, a slight tilt to her head, that suggested she found the entire proceedings mildly amusing. "State your name for the record," Admiral Zeftar commanded, his translator rendering his clicks and hisses into crisp standard galactic. "Commander Rebecca Walsh, Terran Defense Force, serial number 77 Alpha 9926. The name meant nothing to any of them. Earth was barely a footnote in galactic politics, its military considered adequate for local system defense, but hardly worthy of notice among the great powers. Humans had been part of the galactic community for less than 2 centuries, infants by the standards of species that measured their histories in geological epochs. General Morden leaned forward, her voice grinding like tectonic plates. "You seek admission to the Academy's Advanced Strategic Command Program. This is typically reserved for officers who have distinguished themselves in significant military actions." She gestured toward the holographic displays around them, showing fleet battles involving thousands of ships and ground campaigns spanning entire continents. "Your service record shows administrative positions, supply chain management, logistics coordination." "That's correct, General." The crystalline being from the Silicon Confederacy pulsed with colors that the translator interpreted as mild confusion. "Then perhaps you have misunderstood the nature of this program. We are not training accountants or clerks. We forge the next generation of military leaders, beings who will command fleets and shape the strategic balance of power across multiple star systems." Walsh's expression didn't change. "I understand perfectly, Counselor Zarthex." A ripple of something that might have been laughter passed through the Ethereal Collective's representative, its gaseous form shimmering with amusement. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The human shows confidence. "Tell us, young commander, what makes you believe you belong among those who have proven themselves in the crucible of actual warfare? Experience, collective voice, nimbus." Admiral Zeftar's compound eyes focused with laser intensity. "Experience? Your record shows no combat deployments, no campaign ribbons, no battle honors. The most dangerous posting you've held was overseeing supply runs to frontier colonies. That's what my record shows, yes." The admission hung in the air like a challenge. General Morden's massive hand curled into a fist on the table before her. "Are you suggesting your service record is incomplete?" "I'm suggesting that not all service appears in official records, General." Counselor Zarthex's crystalline structure flickered through several color spectrums before settling on a deep purple that indicated skepticism. "Ah, I see. Black operations, perhaps? Classified missions that cannot be acknowledged? How conveniently mysterious. Walsh's smile was barely perceptible, but it was there, a slight upturn at the corner of her mouth that somehow managed to convey volumes. Not mysterious at all, just extensive. The silence that followed stretched long enough for the ambient hum of the station's life support systems to become noticeable. Finally, Admiral Zeftar leaned back in his chair, all 6 arms spreading in a gesture of mock surrender. "Very well, Commander Walsh. We are prepared to be entertained. Tell us of this extensive combat experience that somehow escaped the attention of your own military's record-keeping. Which conflicts would you like me to start with?" The question caught them off guard. General Morden's scarred features twisted into something that might have been amusement. "Conflicts? Plural. Young human, I have personally commanded forces in over 40 major engagements across 6 different star systems. The Iron Republics have been at war for 3 continuous centuries, and I have seen action in campaigns that have reshaped entire sectors. I find it difficult to believe that someone with your limited background has participated in conflicts worthy of the name." Walsh nodded as if considering this. 40 engagements is impressive, General. Respectable for a career officer in a militaristic society. She paused, apparently doing mental calculations. "I believe my count is somewhat higher." Collective voice nimbus rippled with what the translator rendered as condescending amusement. "Oh? And what might that count be, Commander? As of last standard week, approximately 11,467 distinct combat engagements, ranging from small unit actions to fleet-level strategic operations." The room fell completely silent. Even the ambient sounds seemed muted as 7 of the galaxy's most experienced military leaders processed what they had just heard. Admiral Zeftar's compound eyes refocused several times, as if trying to resolve an optical illusion. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Did you say 11,467? Yes. That's counting only engagements where I held an active command or advisory role. If you include missions where I was merely present in a support capacity, the number rises to approximately 14,231. General Morden's granite features had gone completely expressionless. "Commander Walsh, I want to be very clear about what you're claiming. You are stating that you have personally participated in over 11,000 military engagements? Distinct combat engagements, yes. Some were quite brief, 20 minutes or less. Others extended over several months. The longest single campaign lasted approximately 14 standard months and involved coordinated operations across 12 star systems simultaneously." Counselor Zarthex's crystalline form had cycled through several colors before settling on a deep red that indicated either extreme skepticism or outright hostility. "This is preposterous. No being, regardless of species or longevity, could participate in that many combat operations. The logistics alone would be impossible." The logistics were challenging, Walsh agreed, particularly when operating across multiple temporal fronts simultaneously. Supply coordination becomes exponentially more complex when you're managing resources across 17 different timelines, each with their own causal restrictions and paradox protocols. The silence that greeted this statement was absolute. 7 of the most powerful military minds in known space stared at the unremarkable human woman who had just casually referenced temporal warfare as if discussing the weather. Admiral Zeftar found his voice first. "Temporal fronts? The Convergence War," Walsh said simply. "Though I suppose from your perspective, it hasn't happened yet. Or perhaps it has, but the timeline corrections made it appear as if it never occurred. Temporal conflicts tend to be self-erasing from linear historical records." General Morden's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "The Convergence War is a theoretical scenario studied in our most advanced strategic planning courses. It's considered a worst-case analysis of what might happen if multiple temporal manipulation technologies were employed simultaneously across across a minimum of 15 star systems over a period of subjective millennia. Yes, Walsh finished. The theoretical models your strategists developed were quite good, actually. We used several of them as baseline planning documents during the early phases of the conflict. The board members exchanged glances that contained entire conversations. These were beings who had dedicated their lives to the study of warfare in all its forms, who commanded fleets that could sterilize planets and led armies that could conquer star systems. They were familiar with every major conflict in recorded galactic history, every theoretical scenario their war colleges had ever devised, every classified operation their intelligence services had ever conceived. None of them had ever heard of the Convergence War. Collective voice Nimbus drifted closer to the table, its gaseous form flickering with colors that suggested intense curiosity mixed with growing unease. Commander Walsh, I must ask directly, are you claiming to be a time traveler? Walsh's expression grew thoughtful, as if the question required careful consideration. Time travel implies movement from one temporal coordinate to another. What I experienced was more comprehensive. Multiple simultaneous existences across parallel probability matrices, each with their own causal chains and historical outcomes. She gestured vaguely toward the holographic displays around them. Your academy teaches strategy based on linear causality, action and reaction, cause and effect, victory and defeat. When you're fighting across 17 different versions of reality simultaneously, where each tactical decision creates branching possibilities that must all be accounted for and managed. She shrugged. The strategic principles become considerably more complex. Admiral Zeftar's 6 arms had begun tapping against his chair in an unconscious rhythm that indicated extreme agitation among his species. You're describing military operations that are not merely beyond our current technological capabilities, but beyond our theoretical understanding of what warfare could even mean. I understand the confusion, Walsh said with genuine sympathy. It took me approximately 800 subjective years to develop an intuitive grasp of multidimensional tactical thinking. The early campaigns were difficult. I lost several entire timelines to strategic miscalculations before I began to understand how causal warfare actually functions. General Morden had gone very still, her granite features carved into an expression of absolute focus. Commander Walsh, I need you to understand something. I have spent 3 centuries studying every aspect of military science. I have access to classified strategic databases that contain theoretical scenarios developed by the greatest military minds of 7 different species. What you're describing doesn't appear in any of our most advanced theoretical models. That's because your theoretical models are based on linear temporal assumptions, Walsh replied matter-of-factly. When causality becomes fluid, when effect can precede cause, when the same battle can be simultaneously won and lost across different probability matrices, traditional strategic thinking becomes not just inadequate, but actively counterproductive. Counselor Zarthex's crystalline structure was now pulsing through rapid color changes that indicated severe cognitive stress. Even assuming such conflicts were possible, the psychological toll of participating in temporal warfare of the scope you describe would be catastrophic. No mind could retain coherent identity across multiple timeline fractures. Walsh's smile returned, slightly wider this time. No single mind. No, which is why we developed distributed consciousness protocols. By the middle phases of the Convergence War, I was operating as 17 distinct but coordinated personalities, each specialized for different aspects of multidimensional strategic command. She paused, tilting her head slightly. I should mention that 2 of those personalities are still active in parallel timelines that intersect with your current reality matrix. They occasionally provide tactical advice when situations become particularly complex. The admission board had reached a state beyond mere skepticism. They were facing something that challenged their fundamental understanding of what was possible, not just militarily, but conceptually. Admiral Zeftar's compound eyes had gone completely still, a sign of either deep thought or complete cognitive overload among his species. "Commander Walsh," he said slowly, "what you're describing would require not just advanced technology, but an entirely different understanding of the nature of reality itself. Reality is considerably more flexible than most species assume," Walsh agreed. "The hegemony's philosophers actually developed some interesting theoretical frameworks during the later stages of their existence, before the timeline corrections, of course. General Morden's massive form had gone rigid. The hegemony still exists. Admiral Zeftar represents their interests on this board." Walsh blinked, then looked around the room as if seeing it clearly for the first time. "Oh, right. This timeline." She nodded apologetically toward Admiral Zeftar. "Sorry, Admiral. In the timelines where I fought alongside hegemony forces, your species developed quite advanced metaphysical theories before the cascade extinction events. I sometimes forget which developments occur in which reality branch." The room had gone so quiet that individual breathing patterns were audible. 7 military leaders sat frozen, trying to process the casual implications of what they had just heard. Admiral Zeftar's chitinous exoskeleton had begun producing a subtle clicking sound, an involuntary stress response that occurred when his species encountered information their minds couldn't readily categorize. Collective voice. Nimbus broke the silence, its voice carefully controlled. "Commander Walsh, are you suggesting that in some timelines, species that exist in our current reality do not survive?" "Survival is relative when you're dealing with probability matrices," Walsh replied with clinical detachment. "The Iron Republics achieved impressive expansion across 14 star systems in Timeline Branch 7 Alpha, but their militaristic culture ultimately led to a cascade conflict that destabilized their entire galactic sector. The Silicon Confederacy developed fascinating crystalline computing technologies in Branch 12 Gamma, but their lack of biological adaptability made them vulnerable to the viral weapons deployed during the Third Recursion War." She looked around the room, meeting each board member's gaze in turn. The Ethereal Collective actually achieved the most interesting outcome. They developed the ability to exist simultaneously across multiple reality branches, which made them extremely effective at temporal warfare. Unfortunately, that same ability made them targets for the Paradox Hunters during the final phase of the Convergence War. General Morden's voice was barely audible. "And humans?" Walsh's expression grew thoughtful. "Humans proved to be remarkably adaptable. Our psychological flexibility and tendency toward creative problem-solving made us effective at navigating causal inconsistencies. We also had an unusual talent for forming cross-species alliances, even with beings whose fundamental nature was incompatible with our own reality matrix." She paused, apparently considering how much detail to provide. By the end of the Convergence War, human tactical advisors were working with species that exist in dimensions your mathematics haven't discovered yet. We developed combat protocols for fighting enemies that attack through emotional resonance, strategic planning for conflicts where the battlefield exists in the spaces between thoughts, and logistical systems for supporting armies that exist in 17 different states of temporal probability simultaneously. Admiral Zeftar had begun making a low clicking sound that his translator couldn't interpret. Finally, he managed to speak. "Commander Walsh, what you're describing isn't just advanced warfare. It's fundamentally beyond anything we can conceptualize as military conflict. War adapts to available technologies," Walsh said with a shrug. "When temporal manipulation, dimensional folding, and causal engineering become standard tactical tools, traditional concepts like battlefield and enemy become increasingly irrelevant. During the final campaign against the Entropy Syndicate, we were fighting battles that took place in the fundamental mathematical structures that define physical reality itself. Counselor Zarthex had apparently reached the limits of his crystalline species' capacity for processing paradoxical information. His form had locked into a deep purple color that indicated complete cognitive shutdown. "This is impossible," he stated flatly. "What you're describing violates basic principles of causality, logic, and existence itself." Walsh nodded sympathetically. "That was my initial reaction as well. It took approximately 4 centuries of combat experience before I developed an intuitive understanding of post-causal strategic thinking. The learning curve is quite steep when traditional logic becomes a tactical liability." The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses. This wasn't confusion or skepticism. It was the silence of beings whose fundamental worldview had been systematically dismantled by casual conversation. They sat motionless, each trying to process information that didn't fit into any existing framework of understanding. General Morden finally spoke, her granite features etched with something approaching awe. "Commander Walsh, assuming even a fraction of what you've described is accurate, why are you here? Why seek admission to an academy that teaches strategic principles you've apparently transcended by several orders of magnitude?" Walsh's smile became genuinely warm for the first time during the interview. "Because linear warfare is a foundational skill set. Before you can effectively command across multiple probability matrices, you need to thoroughly understand single-timeline tactical thinking. Your academy has an excellent reputation for teaching the fundamentals of conventional military strategy." She gestured toward the holographic displays around them. "Besides, I enjoy the academic environment. There's something refreshing about studying conflicts where causality flows in a single direction, where actions have predictable consequences, where victory and defeat are clearly defined states rather than fluid probability cascades." Admiral Zeftar had apparently recovered enough cognitive function to ask the question that was forming in all their minds. What happens now? How do we evaluate qualifications that exist beyond our ability to comprehend or verify? "You could run a simple verification check," Walsh suggested helpfully. "Your academy's central database is connected to the Galactic Archives, which maintain records of all significant military conflicts across known space and time. If you search for combat engagements involving Commander Rebecca Walsh of the Terran Defense Force, the system should return a comprehensive list." General Morden and Admiral Zeftar exchanged glances. The general's massive hand moved toward the control interface built into the conference table. "Very well, Commander. Let's see what the archives have to say about your extensive service record." The holographic display above the table shimmered, then resolved into the familiar interface of the Galactic Military Archives, a system maintained by 17 different species and containing detailed records of every significant military action in recorded history. General Morden input the search parameters with careful precision, then activated the query. The system processed for several seconds, longer than usual for a simple personnel search. Then the display flickered, showing a loading indicator that seemed to be struggling with an unusually large data set. Progress bars appeared and disappeared, numerical counters scrolled past too quickly to read, and status indicators flashed warnings about query complexity and resource allocation. Finally, the system returned its results. "Error. Query result. Set exceeds maximum displayable parameters. Records found. Data overflow. Please refine search criteria or increase system resource allocation." 7 of the galaxy's most experienced military leaders stared at an error message none of them had ever seen before. General Morden tried again, adding filters to narrow the search parameters. The system processed for 30 seconds before returning the same error message. Admiral Zeftar leaned forward, all 6 arms working the interface simultaneously. "I'm going to try a different approach. Let's search for specific engagement types." He input parameters for major fleet actions, then initiated the search. The system returned the same error message. He tried again, this time searching only for ground-based campaigns. Error message. Strategic planning operations. Error message. Advisory roles in interspecies conflicts. Error message. Finally, collective voice Nimbus drifted closer to the interface, its gaseous form flickering with colors that indicated fascination mixed with growing alarm. Commander Walsh, may I ask, what is the actual number of recorded engagements in your service record? Walsh appeared to be doing mental calculations, occasionally pausing as if consulting with unseen advisors. The linear count within this specific timeline would be approximately 11,467, as I mentioned earlier. But if the archives are attempting to cross-reference engagements across parallel probability matrices, the number would be significantly higher. How much higher? Somewhere in the range of 47 million discrete combat operations across approximately 2,341 different timeline branches and probability matrices. The conference room's life support systems suddenly seemed inadequate. Admiral Zeftar made a choking sound that his translator struggled to render into standard galactic. General Morden's granite features had gone completely slack. Counselor Zarthex appeared to have entered some form of crystalline hibernation state. Of course, Walsh continued conversationally, that's only counting engagements where I held direct command authority or served in a primary advisory role. If you include operations where I was present in a support capacity or conflicts where I influenced tactical outcomes through indirect means, the number approaches the theoretical processing limits of quantum-based counting systems. She paused, apparently noticing the effect her words were having on the board members. I should probably mention that approximately 37% of those engagements took place in timeline branches that were subsequently edited out of existence by the temporal reconciliation protocols. From a technical standpoint, those battles never happened, though I retain full tactical memory of their outcomes. General Morden had found her voice again, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. The galactic archives represent the combined record-keeping efforts of our 17 most advanced civilizations. Their quantum storage systems are theoretically capable of processing data sets the size of entire galactic databases. Quantum systems work very well for linear data, Walsh agreed. They become less efficient when dealing with information that exists in superposition across multiple causal chains. Some of my engagement records exist in states of tactical probability rather than fixed historical outcomes. Admiral Zeftar had apparently reached his species' equivalent of a nervous breakdown. His 6 arms were moving in random patterns while his compound eyes focused and refocused without apparent purpose. This is not possible. You're describing military experience that exceeds the combined combat history of our entire civilization. Several entire civilizations, actually, Walsh corrected gently, though to be fair, most species tend to develop along relatively narrow tactical specializations. Humans seem to have a natural aptitude for adaptive strategy across multiple dimensional frameworks. She gestured toward the still struggling database interface. If you're having trouble accessing the complete record, I could provide a more focused summary. For instance, during the Hegemony Auxiliary Campaign in Timeline Branch 47 Alpha, I served as strategic advisor to Fleet Commander Zeftan during the siege of the Void Gates. Zeftan was quite skilled, actually. His great-great-grandson would probably have similar tactical instincts if the genetic lineages match across timeline branches. Admiral Zeftar's clicking had reached a frequency that suggested imminent psychological collapse. Zeftan was my ancestor. The Void Gates campaign is considered the defining strategic victory in hegemony military history. Our tactical academies study his decisions as examples of perfect fleet coordination. He had good instincts for spatial positioning, Walsh agreed, though his initial approach to the quantum minefields was a bit conservative. After we discussed alternative dimensional approaches to barrier penetration, he developed that elegant flanking maneuver through folded space, quite innovative for linear tactical thinking. The room had reached a state beyond silence. It was the absence of sound that occurs when multiple beings simultaneously experience the limits of their capacity for comprehension. 7 military leaders sat motionless, each trying to process information that redefined not just their understanding of warfare, but their fundamental conception of what military experience could mean. Finally, collective voice Nimbus gathered enough coherence to ask the question that was forming in all their minds. Commander Walsh, if your military experience is as extensive as you claim, why haven't we heard of you before? Why aren't you already commanding fleets or serving as a strategic advisor to major galactic powers? Walsh's expression grew slightly rueful. Temporal warfare has certain side effects. Extended exposure to causal inconsistencies tends to make one's existence somewhat unstable from the perspective of linear reality. Most of my service record exists in classified databases that are accessible only to intelligence agencies with multi-dimensional security clearance. She paused, apparently considering how much detail to provide. There's also the issue that discussing temporal military operations with beings who exist in single timeline frameworks can cause psychological trauma. Your Academy's admission board is actually handling this conversation much better than most military leadership committees. General Mordun's massive form had begun trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the mental effort required to process information that challenged every assumption she had ever made about the nature of military command. Commander Walsh, I need to ask this directly. Are you still human? The question hung in the air with surprising weight. Walsh considered it carefully, tilting her head as if consulting with advisors that only she could perceive. That's a more complex question than it might initially appear. Biologically, yes, my genetic structure remains consistent with baseline human parameters, despite the modifications required for multidimensional existence. Psychologically, the question becomes more interesting. She gestured vaguely toward empty air, as if indicating invisible companions. Extended temporal combat operations require distributed consciousness protocols, as I mentioned earlier. Some aspects of my personality have been optimized for strategic thinking across multiple probability matrices, while others have been enhanced for tactical coordination with non-linear entities. I retain core human characteristics, creativity, adaptability, emotional flexibility, but they've been amplified by several orders of magnitude. Admiral Zeftar had apparently stabilized enough to ask coherent questions. What does that mean in practical terms? Well, for instance, right now I'm simultaneously having this conversation with you while coordinating defensive operations against a crystalline invasion force in Timeline Branch 12 Delta, providing strategic consultation to a coalition of gas beings who are fighting entities made of pure mathematics in probability matrix 7 gamma, and helping to plan evacuation protocols for 17 different versions of Earth that are facing extinction-level events across various reality branches. She smiled apologetically. I hope you'll forgive me if I occasionally seem distracted. The mathematical entities in 7 gamma have just deployed a new form of conceptual warfare that attacks through logical paradoxes, and it requires careful attention to counter effectively. The board members had moved beyond shock into a kind of philosophical numbness. These were beings who had dedicated their lives to understanding the outer limits of strategic possibility, and they were being presented with military experience that transcended their most advanced theoretical models. Counselor Zarthex had apparently emerged from his crystalline hibernation state, his form now pulsing with colors that indicated desperate curiosity. Commander Walsh, may I ask why you're seeking admission to our academy when your military experience apparently exceeds our ability to comprehend or evaluate it? Walsh's smile became genuinely pleased, because this is where the truly interesting challenges begin. Linear warfare, single timeline tactical thinking, conventional cause and effect strategy. These are advanced skills that require dedicated study and practice. Anyone can fight across multiple probability matrices once you understand the basic principles of causal engineering. But developing elegant solutions to straightforward tactical problems? That requires genuine expertise. She gestured toward the holographic displays around them, showing the great victories of galactic military history. Besides, I've always admired the Academy's teaching philosophy. Your instructors have developed remarkably sophisticated approaches to strategic education, given the constraints of single-dimensional thinking. I'm looking forward to studying classical tactical theory from masters who understand the subject at a truly foundational level. General Morden had apparently found her mental footing again, though her voice remained carefully controlled. Commander Walsh, what exactly do you hope to accomplish by studying what you apparently consider elementary tactical principles? Perfection, Walsh replied immediately. Multidimensional warfare is ultimately about managing infinite complexity through superior strategic intuition. But that intuition must be built on a foundation of flawless understanding of basic tactical principles. Every engagement across every probability matrix depends on the same fundamental concepts: positioning, timing, resource allocation, psychological pressure, and adaptive response to changing conditions. She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more animated. Your academy has refined the teaching of these fundamentals to an art form. I've studied tactical records from across 17 different galactic civilizations, and the level of strategic sophistication achieved by your graduates in single timeline engagements is genuinely impressive. I want to learn from instructors who can teach classical warfare with that level of precision and elegance. The admission board exchanged glances that contained entire conversations. They were facing a situation unprecedented in the Academy's history. An applicant whose qualifications were simultaneously beyond their ability to evaluate and perfectly aligned with their educational philosophy. Admiral Zeftar cleared his throat, a sound that his translator rendered as polite attention-seeking. Commander Walsh, I believe I speak for the entire board when I say that your application presents unique evaluation challenges. However, your commitment to foundational strategic education suggests a level of intellectual humility that we find refreshing. He paused, apparently gathering his thoughts. There is, however, one practical consideration. Our advanced strategic command program is designed to challenge students with increasingly complex tactical scenarios. Given your apparent background, I'm uncertain whether our curriculum would provide appropriate academic rigor. Walsh's smile widened. Admiral, I think you underestimate the complexity of single-timeline strategic thinking. When you can only make decisions once, when actions have permanent consequences, when victory and defeat are final states rather than probability cascades, the precision required for optimal tactical choices becomes exponentially more demanding. She gestured toward the error messages still displayed on the conference room's database interface. Multidimensional warfare allows for recursive optimization. You can literally fight the same battle thousands of times across different probability branches until you achieve perfect tactical execution. Linear warfare requires you to make optimal decisions based on incomplete information, knowing that mistakes cannot be corrected by switching to alternate timeline branches. General Morden's granite features had arranged themselves into something approaching comprehension. You're suggesting that conventional warfare is more challenging than temporal combat operations? Conventional warfare requires genuine strategic genius, Walsh replied with conviction. When Admiral Zeftar's ancestor executed that flanking maneuver through folded space during the Void Gates campaign, he made a perfect tactical decision based on real-time battlefield analysis and intuitive understanding of spatial positioning. He couldn't run thousands of probability analyses or consult with alternate versions of himself. He simply recognized the optimal solution and executed it flawlessly. She shook her head in apparent admiration. That kind of strategic brilliance is what I hope to develop through dedicated study of classical tactical theory. Anyone can win battles when they have infinite chances to optimize their approach. Winning battles with single-chance decision-making, that requires the kind of sophisticated strategic education that only institutions like your academy can provide. The conference room had settled into a different kind of silence. not the stunned confusion of earlier, but the contemplative quiet of beings processing a perspective that was both alien and surprisingly logical. 7 military leaders sat considering the possibility that what they had always regarded as the most advanced form of strategic education might actually be preparation for challenges beyond their current understanding. Collective voice Nimbus drifted closer to the table, its gaseous form flickering with colors that indicated thoughtful analysis. Commander Walsh, your perspective on strategic education is intriguing. However, there remains the practical question of how we might structure a curriculum appropriate for someone with your unique background. Standard curriculum would be perfect, Walsh replied immediately. Introduction to Strategic Principles, Classical Tactical Analysis, Multi-Species Command Dynamics, Resource Management Theory, Psychological Warfare Fundamentals. I'm particularly looking forward to that last one. Understanding how to influence enemy decision-making through conventional psychological pressure rather than direct cognitive manipulation should provide excellent mental discipline. Admiral Zeftar's compound eyes had focused with what appeared to be growing interest. You're suggesting that you would benefit from studying elementary psychological warfare techniques? Elementary techniques often require the most sophisticated application, Walsh explained. When you're fighting enemies that exist as pure emotion or communicate through dream logic, psychological warfare becomes a matter of matching cognitive frequencies and manipulating conceptual resonance patterns. But influencing the tactical decisions of beings who think in linear causality, that requires genuine understanding of individual psychology, cultural motivation, and strategic communication. She paused, apparently consulting with invisible advisors again. Besides, I suspect your instructors have developed approaches to psychological warfare that I haven't encountered. Human tactical doctrine tends to emphasize adaptation and improvisation, but other species have created more systematic approaches to strategic influence. I'm hoping to learn methodologies that I can integrate into my existing combat protocols. General Morden had begun displaying the first signs of genuine enthusiasm since the interview began. Her granite features had shifted into an expression that suggested professional interest overcoming skepticism. Commander Walsh, you've described experience that transcends our understanding of military possibility, yet you're requesting admission to study what you characterize as foundational principles. This suggests a level of intellectual discipline that we rarely encounter. The most advanced strategic thinking depends on perfect mastery of fundamental concepts, Walsh replied. During the final phases of the Convergence War, victory often hinged on split-second decisions about basic tactical principles, positioning, timing, resource allocation. When you're managing combat operations across thousands of probability matrices simultaneously, any weakness in foundational understanding becomes exponentially magnified. She gestured toward the holographic displays around them. Your academy has refined the teaching of strategic fundamentals to a level of precision that I genuinely respect. I want to study under instructors who can teach me to think about classical warfare with the same mathematical elegance that your best graduates bring to single-timeline tactical problems. Counselor Zarthex had apparently reached some form of crystalline resolution, his form now pulsing with colors that indicated cautious acceptance. Commander Walsh, your application raises questions that extend far beyond normal admission procedures. However, your articulated commitment to foundational strategic education suggests genuine scholarly intent. He paused, his crystalline structure cycling through several color patterns that indicated complex deliberation. There is the question of how we might verify your qualifications when they apparently exceed our system's capacity to process. However, there is also the question of whether verification is necessary when the applicant specifically requests instruction in elementary strategic principles. Admiral Zeftar nodded slowly, all 6 arms moving in patterns that suggested careful consideration. The Academy's mission is to provide the highest quality strategic education to qualified military officers. Commander Walsh has demonstrated both the intellectual sophistication to benefit from advanced instruction and the humility to recognize the value of foundational coursework. General Morden's massive form had straightened into a more formal posture. I find myself genuinely curious about how someone with Commander Walsh's apparent background would approach our tactical analysis coursework. The perspective she brings might prove illuminating for both instructors and fellow students. The board members exchanged glances that contained entire conversations about precedent, policy, and the fundamental nature of strategic education. Finally, Admiral Zeftar leaned forward, his compound eyes focusing with decision-making intensity. Commander Walsh, the board has reached a preliminary consensus. Your application presents evaluation challenges that are literally unprecedented in Academy history. However, your articulated educational goals align precisely with our institutional mission, and your demonstrated intellectual approach suggests you would benefit from rigorous foundational strategic coursework. He paused, apparently choosing his words carefully. We are prepared to offer you conditional admission to the Advanced Strategic Command Program, pending resolution of certain administrative complexities regarding your service record verification. Walsh's expression brightened with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. Thank you, Admiral. I appreciate the board's willingness to work with unconventional documentation issues. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. Actually, if verification is a concern, I should mention that 3 of my former commanding officers are currently accessible for reference interviews. General Morden's eyebrows, massive ridges of granite-like material, rose slightly. Officers who can verify your service record? Fleet Admiral Keth Moran of the Hegemony 4th Expeditionary Force, General Yarthen of the Iron Republic's Temporal Defense Division, and Collective Commander Nithvar of the Ethereal Alliance Strategic Corps, Walsh recited matter-of-factly, though I should warn you that contacting them might create certain temporal complications for your current reality branch. Admiral Zeftar's clicking had returned, though at a much lower frequency, that suggested manageable stress rather than cognitive collapse. Temporal complications? Well, Fleet Admiral Keth Moran exists approximately 400 years in your future. General Yarthen is currently fighting a war that won't begin for another 6 centuries, and Collective Commander Nithvar exists in a state of quantum superposition that makes standard communication protocols somewhat challenging. Walsh shrugged apologetically. Reference verification can be complicated when your service record spans multiple temporal frameworks. The board members had apparently developed some immunity to ontological shock over the course of the interview. Counselor Zarthex pulsed with colors that indicated resigned acceptance rather than cognitive overload. Commander Walsh, perhaps we should discuss more practical verification approaches. Actually, Walsh said, brightening, there is one reference who exists in your current timeline and should be easily accessible through standard channels. Colonel Miranda Hayes, currently serving as Chief of Strategic Planning for the Terran Defense Force's Advanced Concepts Division. General Morden activated the conference table's communication interface. We can contact Colonel Hayes immediately if you're comfortable with that approach. Please do. Though I should mention that Colonel Hayes has classification restrictions regarding certain aspects of my service record. She'll be able to confirm my basic qualifications and recommend me for advanced strategic education, but she won't be able to discuss specific operational details. The holographic display shimmered, then resolved into the standard communication interface for secure military channels. General Morden input the contact information with practiced efficiency, and within moments the display showed Colonel Hayes's office aboard the TDF headquarters station. Colonel Hayes appeared to be in her 50s, with graying brown hair and the weathered features of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions under pressure. Her uniform bore the service ribbons of a career officer, though notably fewer than most colonels of her apparent seniority. When she saw Walsh on the display, her expression shifted to something between relief and exasperation. "Rebecca," she said without preamble, Please tell me you haven't been discussing operational specifics with the Academy Admission Board. Nothing beyond general strategic principles, Miranda. I've been very careful about classification boundaries. Colonel Hayes visibly relaxed. Thank you. Admiral Zeftar, General Morden, I assume you're calling about Commander Walsh's application to your Advanced Strategic Command Program? Admiral Zeftar leaned forward, all 6 arms positioned in formal attention posture. Colonel Hayes, we're attempting to verify Commander Walsh's qualifications for Advanced Strategic Education. Her application materials are unusual. I imagine they are. Colonel Hayes's expression contained the weary patience of someone who had been through similar conversations many times before. Let me be clear about what I can and cannot discuss. Commander Walsh has served with distinction in numerous classified operations requiring advanced strategic thinking and multi-dimensional tactical analysis. Her qualifications for your program exceed any reasonable academic standard. General Morden's granite features arranged themselves into a careful, neutral expression. Colonel, Commander Walsh has claimed combat experience that challenges our understanding of what military service might entail. I'm sure she has. Colonel Hayes rubbed her temples as if fighting a headache. Rebecca has a tendency to be comprehensive when discussing her background. However, I can confirm that she has participated in strategic operations of unprecedented complexity and demonstrated tactical abilities that qualify her for the most advanced military education available. She paused, apparently choosing her words carefully. I can also confirm that her interest in foundational strategic education is genuine and appropriate. The nature of her previous assignments makes traditional tactical training both necessary and valuable for her continued professional development. Counselor Zarthex pulsed with colors, indicating cautious inquiry. Colonel Hayes, are you able to provide any specific details about Commander Walsh's service record, beyond what I've already stated? Number. However, I can tell you that the Terran Defense Force considers her one of our most valuable strategic assets, and we enthusiastically support her application to your academy. She has our highest recommendation for admission to any program she chooses to pursue. Admiral Zeftar exchanged glances with his fellow board members before continuing. Colonel, Commander Walsh has suggested that her combat experience spans multiple temporal frameworks. Are you able to comment on that claim? Colonel Hayes was silent for several long seconds, her expression cycling through various levels of official discretion. Admiral, there are aspects of contemporary military operations that remain classified at the highest levels of interspecies security protocols. I can neither confirm nor deny specific operational methodologies, but I can state that Commander Walsh's strategic experience encompasses scenarios that your Academy's curriculum is designed to address, even if her experience allegedly includes unconventional temporal elements. Especially then, Colonel Hayes replied with emphasis. If you're asking whether Commander Walsh would benefit from rigorous foundational strategic education, the answer is absolutely yes. If you're asking whether she's qualified to handle your most advanced coursework, the answer is that she's probably overqualified by several orders of magnitude. General Morden leaned back in her chair, her massive form settling with the sound of shifting stone. Colonel Hayes, can you help us understand why someone with Commander Walsh's apparent qualifications would seek admission to study what she characterizes as elementary strategic principles? Colonel Hayes's expression softened slightly, showing the first hint of personal warmth since the conversation began. Because Rebecca understands something that most military officers never grasp, that advanced strategic thinking depends entirely on perfect mastery of fundamental principles. The more complex your operational environment becomes, the more critical it is to have flawless understanding of basic tactical concepts. She gestured toward something off-screen, apparently referring to classified materials. I can't discuss specifics, but Commander Walsh has participated in strategic operations where microscopic errors in foundational thinking led to cascade failures across entire operational frameworks. She recognizes that studying classical warfare theory with master instructors will strengthen her strategic capabilities, regardless of how advanced her previous experience might have been. Walsh nodded approvingly. Miranda always understood the educational philosophy better than most of my commanding officers. That's because I've seen what happens when strategic thinking becomes so specialized that it loses connection to foundational principles, Colonel Hayes replied. Rebecca, your academy admission is one of the smartest professional development decisions you've made in years. Admiral Zeftar had apparently reached some form of decision-making resolution. His compound eyes focused with determination as he addressed Colonel Hayes. Colonel, based on your recommendation and our evaluation of Commander Walsh's educational objectives, the Academy Board is prepared to approve her admission to the Advanced Strategic Command Program. Excellent decision, Admiral. Rebecca will be an asset to both your faculty and fellow students. Colonel Hayes paused, her expression becoming slightly more serious. However, I should mention that there may be occasional administrative complications related to her continued involvement in classified operations. General Mordun's granite features showed mild concern. What sort of complications? Nothing that should interfere with her academic progress, Colonel Hayes assured them. But Rebecca occasionally receives mission assignments that require her immediate attention. These assignments take priority over all other commitments, including academic obligations. Walsh looked apologetic. I should have mentioned that during the interview process. My current operational status includes emergency recall protocols for temporal stabilization missions. If reality cascade failures or paradox incursions occur in this galactic sector, I might need to take temporary leaves of absence from coursework. The board members absorbed this information with the resigned patience of beings who had already adjusted their worldview several times during the conversation. Collective voice. Nimbus drifted closer to the display, its gaseous form flickering with colors that indicated professional curiosity. Commander Walsh, may I ask how frequently such emergency assignments occur? Walsh appeared to consult with invisible advisors before answering. In this timeline branch? Perhaps 3 or 4 times per standard year, lasting anywhere from a few hours to several months of subjective time, though if the Entropy Syndicate resumes active operations, the frequency could increase significantly. Colonel Hayes nodded confirmation. The Academy should be prepared for occasional unexplained absences, though Rebecca has always returned to complete her assignments once operational requirements are resolved. Admiral Zeftar's 6 arms moved in patterns that suggested careful consideration of practical logistics. Commander Walsh, given these operational constraints, would you prefer a modified academic schedule that accommodates potential emergency deployments? Standard scheduling should be fine, Admiral. Multi-dimensional time management makes it relatively easy to attend classes and complete assignments regardless of parallel operational commitments. Walsh paused, apparently realizing that her answer might require clarification. I can exist in several temporal states simultaneously, so emergency missions typically don't interfere with academic obligations from the perspective of linear time flow. General Mordun had apparently reached the limits of her capacity for processing temporal logistics. Commander Walsh, for the sake of practical planning, should we assume that you will maintain perfect attendance and complete all assignments according to standard academy schedules? Yes, General. From your perspective, my academic performance should appear completely normal, regardless of what operational assignments I might be managing in parallel time streams. Colonel Hayes smiled with what appeared to be genuine affection. Rebecca has never missed a deadline or failed to complete an assignment, regardless of how complex her operational environment might become. She takes academic commitments very seriously. Academic discipline is essential for strategic development, Walsh agreed. Besides, studying classical tactical theory provides excellent mental relaxation after extended periods of multi-dimensional combat operations. The admission board had apparently reached a state of philosophical equilibrium regarding Walsh's unconventional background. Admiral Zeftar's compound eyes showed the focused attention of someone making formal administrative decisions rather than trying to process impossible information. Very well, Commander Walsh. Based on Colonel Hayes's recommendation, your articulated educational objectives, and our evaluation of your intellectual approach to strategic studies, the Academy Admission Board formally approves your acceptance to the Advanced Strategic Command Program. Walsh's smile showed genuine pleasure and gratitude. Thank you, Admiral. I'm looking forward to studying under instructors who understand classical warfare at such a sophisticated level. General Morden activated the administrative interface, beginning the process of generating official admission documentation. Commander Walsh, standard orientation begins in 3 standard weeks. Will that timeline accommodate your current operational commitments? Perfect timing, General. I should have the probability matrix 7 gamma situation stabilized by then, and the crystalline invasion in timeline branch 12 delta is proceeding according to acceptable parameters. Colonel Hayes nodded approvingly. Rebecca, make sure you complete the pre-enrollment psychological evaluation before orientation begins. Academy regulations require current mental health assessments for all incoming students. Of course, Miranda, though I should probably mention to the evaluation staff that I'm currently operating with 17 distinct personality matrices distributed across multiple timeline branches. Standard psychological assessment protocols might return some unusual results. The board members had developed enough immunity to ontological shock that this revelation caused only minor ripples of resigned acceptance. Counselor Zarthex pulsed with colors that indicated bureaucratic concern rather than existential confusion. Commander Walsh, will the Academy's medical staff be able to conduct meaningful psychological evaluations given your distributed mental architecture? I can consolidate into a single personality matrix for assessment purposes, Walsh assured him, though I should warn them that temporary consciousness integration sometimes causes minor reality fluctuations in the immediate area. Nothing dangerous, just occasional violations of local causality and brief manifestations of alternative probability states. Colonel Hayes sighed with the weary patience of a supervisor who had managed difficult personnel for decades. Rebecca, please try to minimize reality disturbances during your evaluation appointment. Academy medical staff aren't cleared for temporal anomaly exposure. I'll be very careful, Miranda. Standard medical protocols, minimal probability cascade effects, no manifestation of alternate timeline versions during the interview process. Admiral Zeftar had apparently decided that practical administrative concerns took precedence over philosophical implications. Commander Walsh, you'll receive official admission documentation within 48 hours, along with course selection materials and housing assignment information. Do you have any specific accommodation requirements for your living situation? Walsh considered this carefully. Standard quarters should be adequate, Admiral, though it might be helpful if my room has minimal shared walls with other students' quarters. Multi-dimensional existence sometimes causes acoustic anomalies that could be disturbing to beings who exist in single timeline frameworks. We'll ensure you receive accommodations that provide appropriate privacy, General Morden assured her, making notes on her administrative interface. Is there anything else the Academy should be aware of regarding your integration into the student community? Nothing significant, General. I interact normally with single timeline beings, despite my distributed consciousness architecture. Fellow students should find me quite approachable for study groups, tactical discussions, and standard social activities. She paused, apparently consulting with invisible advisors again, though I should mention that I occasionally receive tactical updates from parallel timeline versions of myself. If other students notice me responding to information that isn't immediately apparent, I'm probably just coordinating strategic decisions across multiple probability matrices. Collective voice nimbus flickered with colors that indicated amused acceptance. Commander Walsh, your integration into Academy life promises to be interesting. We look forward to observing how your unique perspective influences our educational environment. Colonel Hayes leaned forward in the display, her expression becoming more serious. Admiral, General, counselors, I want to emphasize that despite Rebecca's unconventional background, she's one of the most dedicated and professional officers I've ever supervised. Her commitment to strategic excellence and educational development makes her an ideal candidate for your program. We appreciate your strong recommendation, Colonel Hayes, Admiral Zeftar replied formally. Based on our evaluation, we believe Commander Walsh will benefit significantly from the Academy's strategic education program, while potentially contributing valuable perspectives to classroom discussions and tactical analysis exercises. Walsh nodded gratefully toward the display. Thank you, Miranda, for the reference recommendation, and thank you, Admiral, for the Academy's willingness to accommodate unconventional applications. Colonel Hayes smiled with evident satisfaction. Rebecca, make sure you actually attend your classes instead of just existing in multiple temporal states simultaneously. The Academy's instructors will expect direct engagement with course material. Of course, Miranda, I'm particularly excited about the Psychological Warfare Fundamentals course. Understanding how to influence single timeline decision-making processes should provide excellent strategic discipline. Just remember that your fellow students don't have access to multi-dimensional tactical analysis, Colonel Hayes warned. Try not to solve strategic problems so quickly that you accidentally intimidate the other students. General Morden had apparently finished processing the admission documentation. Commander Walsh, your official acceptance materials will be transmitted to your current address within the specified time frame. Welcome to the Galactic Military Academy. The board members rose in unison, each displaying their species' formal gesture of respectful farewell. Walsh stood as well, maintaining perfect military posture despite the casual confidence that had characterized her throughout the interview. Thank you again for this opportunity, she said, addressing each board member in turn. I'm genuinely looking forward to studying classical strategic theory under such accomplished instructors. As the communication link with Colonel Hayes closed and the board members began filing out of the conference room, Admiral Zeftar lingered for a moment, his compound eyes focused with what appeared to be lingering curiosity. Commander Walsh, if you don't mind my asking, why does someone with your apparent strategic capabilities choose to exist primarily in this timeline branch rather than focusing on the more complex, operational environments you've described? Walsh's expression grew thoughtful, and for the first time during the interview, she seemed to consider her words carefully before responding. Because this timeline branch represents something rare and valuable, Admiral. Most probability matrices are dominated by species that have developed along narrow specialization paths, beings who excel at specific types of tactical thinking, but lack the flexibility to adapt to genuinely novel strategic challenges. She gestured toward the holographic displays still showing the great victories of galactic military history. Your civilization, the Academy, the entire interspecies alliance you've built here, you've achieved something remarkably sophisticated, multiple species working together, each contributing their unique strategic capabilities while learning from each other's tactical approaches. She paused, apparently consulting with invisible advisors before continuing. In most timeline branches, species either develop in isolation and remain strategically limited, or they encounter each other through conflict and destroy the potential for collaborative strategic development. This reality branch has achieved something genuinely rare, a multi-species military culture that combines the tactical strengths of multiple evolutionary approaches. Admiral Zeftar's clicking had settled into a rhythm that suggested deep contemplation. You're suggesting that our interspecies alliance represents an unusual strategic achievement? It represents the optimal foundation for addressing the challenges that are coming, Admiral. Walsh's expression had grown more serious. The enemies that threaten reality across multiple timeline branches, the Entropy Syndicate, the Paradox Hunters, the entities that exist in the spaces between mathematical concepts, they can't be defeated by any single species' tactical approach. She looked around the conference room, taking in the symbols and displays representing 7 different military traditions. but a coalition of species that have learned to integrate their strategic philosophies while maintaining their individual tactical advantages. That combination has the flexibility and adaptability to survive challenges that would destroy more specialized civilizations. General Morden had paused in the doorway, apparently listening to the conversation. "Commander Walsh, are you suggesting that our alliance faces threats we haven't yet encountered?" Walsh's smile returned, though it now contained elements of reassurance mixed with determination. "I'm suggesting that your alliance represents the kind of strategic thinking that creates solutions before problems become crises. The Academy's educational philosophy, teaching fundamental principles that work across multiple tactical contexts, is exactly the kind of preparation that builds resilience against unknown challenges." She gestured toward the still struggling database interface. "Besides, studying classical warfare under master instructors will help me develop the precision and elegance that your strategic traditions represent. When the next phase of interdimensional conflicts begins, I want to contribute tactical solutions that are worthy of the collaborative standards your alliance has achieved." Admiral Zeftar's compound eyes had focused with something approaching satisfaction. "Commander Walsh, I believe your admission to the Academy will benefit both your strategic development and our institutional understanding of advanced tactical thinking." "Thank you, Admiral. I'm genuinely honored to be part of an educational community that understands strategic thinking at such a sophisticated level." As the board members finally departed, leaving Walsh alone in the conference room, she stood quietly for several moments, apparently coordinating with the invisible advisors that had been present throughout the interview. Finally, she nodded to herself and walked toward the exit, her expression showing the satisfied anticipation of someone looking forward to new challenges. The Galactic Military Academy had just admitted a student whose qualifications exceeded their ability to comprehend or verify, whose service record crashed their most advanced database systems, and whose casual conversation had fundamentally challenged their understanding of what military experience could mean. She was looking forward to studying elementary tactical principles with master instructors who could teach her to think about classical warfare with mathematical precision and elegant simplicity. And somewhere in the Academy's administrative databases, error messages continued scrolling past parameters too large for the system to process, while quantum storage arrays struggled to catalog military experience that spanned probability matrices and timeline branches that their creators had never imagined. The Advanced Strategic Command Program was about to become significantly more interesting.